really delighted to be with my colleagues from around the world. And welcome to everyone. I think we've got some of Bombay's diplomats here, so we're really happy that you were able to attend as well. I'm going to jump right in. This session is about reforming the T20. And Erin and I were having a conversation. I mean, the T20 is pretty young. It's 10 years old, maybe a little older, 10 years old. I don't know whether it needs reform or just a little more education. So learnings, education, it needs to develop and really grow into its teens and then become an adult. So I'm going to start. We were given some questions and I'm going to start asking questions. I'm going to work this way. And we're nicely sitting, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy. It's a good. So Dean Sanope, I'm going to ask you the first question because, in fact, you have an edited book on the T20, and it's called A World in Crisis, A World in Progress, Growing Better Together, Lessons from a Decade of the T20. And I would urge all of you to read it because it is full of wonderful information on the T20 and what it does. Many in India really are not that familiar with the G20 or the T20 or its sub-forums. So this is an enlightening book and extremely helpful. So thanks for that from a fellow think tanker. Now I'm going to ask you the first question is, what progress has the T20 has certain goals, right? It's multidisciplinary. It's supposed to play an important role in the G20. But it's supposed to have academic engagement, it's supposed to have independent funding, and integrated. It talks about what society should do, and then it feeds back all this information into the G20. But you say it needs reform, and so you have some ideas on the reform, and what progress have been made in achieving, A, the T20 objectives, and what do you think the reform should be?
Actually, I have 4 things that we should do to improve the T20, and this one is one of the 4. So naturally, to improve the T20, then we should review what the T20 have done, right? So the last year marked the 10th anniversary of T20. So we wanted to have this book published last year, but unfortunately there was a kind of delay, and then we published this year, earlier this year. We are very happy, and then so this is a kind of review of what the T20 achieved for the last 10 years. And then the very good book, so please read it. And then this is electronic version of this book. Is freely available, downloadable from the ADBI website. And then, but there is one problem about this book. The problem is that photos on this cover and also chapter title pages are too good. So attract people's attention to these photos. But other content is also very, very good. So the photos were taken by our colleague Nicolas Boucher. He managed to take this summit of Himalaya from the airplane. And then there are other 3 things. So when I read the title of this, or theme of this panel discussion, how to improve the T20, I asked myself, why am I in T20? Why am I working at and operating think tank? The answer is that I believe that think tanks, especially a global community of think tanks, can play a very important role and can contribute a lot to making our wishes to live in more sustainable planet, peaceful world, a harmonious society, and prosperous economy come true. Right? And then, in order to make the impact of activities of think tanks, a global think tank community, stronger, there are 4 things to do. One is to review, and then second thing is to you know, take advantage of the multiple fora, like T20, T7, and also BRICS, right? So when the T20 presidency goes to the United States and Canada after South Africa, then T7 and T20 become very similar. So then BRICS will play an important role, right? So, and then although all those think tank fora are open to the think tanks in the world, so the participating think tanks are same groups, but if the organizers are different, and then some issues can be discussed, cannot be discussed, so we can take different fora effectively. So that's one. And also it's better to make a joint statement, a joint call to action to have a stronger impact, if possible, and if it seems to be impactful. And then the third thing is to strengthen the collaboration with other engagement groups, especially science, because think tanks want to bridge policy making and research. So science group is important, and the civil society, Civil 7, Civil 20, also important because they inform what the people's need, right? And they also youth, they have a longer time perspective because they are young. So listen to their voices is also important. And then work together. By working together, we will amplify their voices, and they will amplify our voices. So we should work together with them. And the last thing is maybe more things. Dashboard, T7 summit, T7 communique we have had toward the end of last month in Tokyo. Propose to start designing of G7, G20 dashboard. So I hope that T20 will also join this effort to monitor what happened to those huge number of pledges, commitments, or promises made by the global leaders every time, every year at G7 or G20 or other occasions. So this is difficult, but this must be done by think tanks, right? But in order to achieve this dashboard, we have to have continuity, okay? So that's why the T20 Indonesia, T20 India, and then Brazil, South Africa, this continuity is very important. And then again, let me come back to this. So occasionally, from time to time, we should review what we did. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. That gives us an interesting. I'll come back with some ideas on what you said, but I'm going to get Gulbin to come in. Gulbin, Turkey has been you held your T20 in 2015 after Australia, right? How do you think? So you've had a long run, you and Erin, on the T20. How do you think the T20 can communicate its ideas to a wider audience and adapt, especially to the digital era? Let's just talk about the wider audience first, because we tend to be very insidey. We talk to ourselves, but are we communicating what we do to a broader audience, to civil society? Are we doing that well enough?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the organizers for this great 2 days, even 3 days. So thank you. First I want to mention, referring Mr. Sonabe, he mentioned about the presence of G20, G7, BRICS, that we are an umbrella, but we are also a picture to the outside world. That's our mission, I guess, in 220, because we don't have borders. So that's the that makes us unique platform as well, including the experts, bureaucrats, the think tanks. So it's a big, unique platform. So we are basing our research independent research. And then comes to the communication is very key, as our chairman, woman, Mrs. Kripalani mentioned. So communication is key, really, because we have big efforts. We have 1,400 policy briefs, and we are working, hundreds of people working then, but then we have to come up with 10 action plans, right? We have to distill all of this. So this gap is filled by our skillful communication. So then we have the digital world. We have to use it very successfully. In Italian presidency, it was tackled reforming T20 firstly, and there was a list of proposals how to communicate better. So and there was a list, and since 2020 to 2023, we have Indonesia and India, and we see that how big achievements they have done. So they are using the social media very successfully. Even you visit the websites, you see the development, how successfully things evolve. So I particularly want to note the highlights videos, for example. That's very, very good attempts. And the commentaries, for example, they fill the gap of lacking policy briefs, publications, for example. They have timely commentaries so that we can have some flavor what we are working on. And so this is the current successes during our time. In 2015, we were not that active, of course, because digitalization was not that common. But for Troika presence, for example, we were holding the presidency in 2015. Starting from 2013, we established representative offices in Australia and China. So we had dedicated staff just to cooperate these two countries, and they were there for 3 years. So I think authorities, hosting country authorities, has to be in charge years earlier, and then start cooperating earlier. That was, I think, very important for hosting countries.
That's a very important point, that the Troika countries have to work closely together, and setting up an office so that you can have that continued communication rather than just government to government, think tank to think tank. That's a very good idea. And Renata, that brings me to you. Brazil will be the next president, and do think about opening an office in India. So there can be some communication. Then to South Africa, because we not only have to Dean Sonobe's point, not only the T20, but also the regional groupings can maybe start working together. And we do have IPSA. So
we do have, under the umbrella of T20, we have the T7, which is a subgroup. And of course, we have BRICS, we have IPSA. We have a number of other groups. Having said that, our reading is that the T20 exercise, so to speak, is work in progress. What meaning by that is the very fact that there is a good deal of lack of knowledge what T20 means, what T20 does, and what's T20 for. Part of the work in organizing the T20 is precisely to try and involve an increasing number of institutions, not only individuals, but institutions, as a precondition for the sustainability that Sushi was so concerned about. So this is one of the challenges in the process of organizing this process. If you allow me, I would like to make public, for the first time, what we have in mind and how are we starting to crawl in this process. We have constituted in Brazil a steering committee of 4 institutions, my own institution, the IPEA, the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, SEBRE, which is a Center for the Studies of Brazilian International Relations, and Fundação Alexandre Gourmand, which is a foundation linked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we are the 4 that are in charge of organizing the whole lot. Now, having said that, we depart from some principles, if I may call that way. The first one is that the T20, the chances for the T20 being have continuity is to not only provide topics to the G20 each year, but to have some kind of reflection and possibility of joining efforts to try and identify the global issues and provide solutions for that. So it's very basic that the focus should be on global issues. Now, having said that, it should maximize the participation of think tanks all over the world. And it should intensify the relationship among these think tanks as a means to contribute to identifying really the global issues and the proposed solutions. And coming back to the Tsushi point and the, sorry, I can't read the name, for there are flowers there, concern with divulgation, the work of the T20 does not end in providing the topics to G20. So we have to first, of course, work and bring some identification of problems, global problems, and identification of solutions to the G20. 1. 2, from the moment that we identify what seems to us as the main pressing global issues and the solutions, we should go back and double check that with those groups that presumably are the experts on those issues, meaning by that W20, L20, B20, and you name it, the half alphabet under the 20 umbrella. Third, we have to bring this debate to the society, civil society, via events, so webinars, publications, you name it, so that over the years, there would be a conversion, a build-up of identifying what would be the most sensitive issues and a debate about what would be the likely solutions for that. Now, we are working with the perspective of having 6 task force, each one with 6 co-chairs. We are in the process of identifying specific subjects, and we should divulge that in 1 or 2 months, June, July, we should come out and make it that public. How would be the participation? How consistent can we be in terms of bringing these think tanks worldwide, or at least 20 plus countries, if not worldwide, at least 20 plus countries, to participate in this process via extensive divulgation. The policy briefs will be designed, the proposals, according to a uniform template, so all of them with the same shape, regarding to size and the structure, the sessions, and they should comprise solutions or proposals for each issue. For those of us who are acquainted with international trade theory, you have already learned or heard about the 2x2x2 model. It's the basic for international trade theory. It's 2 countries, 2 productive sectors, 2 factors of production. No? We are going to have a 2 plus 2 plus 2 times 2 times 2 model for the policy briefs. Meaning by that, 1, gender balance. All the proposals have to be submitted by a male and a female, precondition. 2, the authors have to be from at least 2 countries, so as to avoid the discussion of domestic issues, to go for global issues. Assurance that the focus will be on global issues. 3, the authors have to be from different institutions, because you have some institutions that have agencies everywhere. So you have to have different agenda, different countries and different institutions as a precondition of identifying precisely what is not local problems, but global problems, and how to deal with that. So these are how we are designing this process, and we are aiming at having webinars June, July at most, to make it public and with more details. Thank you.
Thank you. We will look forward to that. Erin, I think Renato has answered some of the question of how the T20 can adapt to, shifting contexts in the world. I'm going to come back to you and ask you, really, how can the T20 communicate its ideas with the wider audience? Because you have been thinking about that. And, what is it that we should be doing apart from just talking to each other? I think that's very important. And really, do you also think that the T20 needs reform?
Yeah, I mean, at the very beginning, I said to you, does the T20 need reform? And reform is a really strong word.
Yes.
And like you say, it's growing up, and I think that's a much better framing. So for some context, I've been working in and out of India for about 12 years now. In fact, my first boss was here. He just walked out, which is a little bit disappointing. Nagesh Kumar, wherever you are. And this is my 8th G20 for all of my sins, but my first T20. And so my observation of the T20 from this first year of being involved is, not bad, having seen many other engagement groups. It's well funded, it's been well organised, well structured. Some of the expectations have been set early. But where do we go to from here? And I think a lot of the problems that problems is the wrong word, but a lot of the things that I would say about how we could strengthen the engagement groups it's not actually about the T20, but it's about engagement groups more broadly. So if you think about, when the G20 was established or elevated to a leaders level, it was around the time of a crisis, right? And then you essentially had, a decade of, relatively prosperous is the wrong word, that's not universal, but, it was pretty good for a decade there, right? We didn't really have to deal with any big global crises through the G20. And during that time, this mandate creep kind of came in. So lots of different groups being set up. I mean, the alphabet soup of engagement groups we talk about, and, they're all equally, they're all really important and all make an important contribution. But it meant that the G20 has become this enormous organisation of all of these different groups with all of these different competing interests. And so then when it came to the next crisis that the G20 really had to deal with, which was probably the pandemic, could it be galvanised in a way that, that would be useful? And I think that it struggled around that time. But this kind of goes back to why we're here. And I think that what engagement groups need to do is set that up better at the outset. So, and we saw this today in some of our conversations in the task forces as well. So people who are delegates and whoever's hosting really needs to set out, well, how does this engagement group fit into the bigger G20 structure? So what is track 1? What is track 2? What is the role of each? And setting out those objectives right at the beginning of the year. And part of the challenge with something like the G20 is that's not fixed. Because if we all sat together here today and decided, let's come up with a governance structure for the T20, Brazil can say, next year. The government can come in and say, actually, that's not how we want to do it. And we see that with the engagement groups where you have engagement, you have, people who are at the head of delegations who think that they'll go on to be the Sherpa or the chair, and then the government comes in and says, well, actually, no, we're putting our people into those roles. And then you need to self-organise beneath that. So this is also part of the challenge, right? But that setting out where you fit that year to everybody and understanding those objectives. And the other thing that I've observed over the years among many engagement groups is about what the end game is of the engagement group. Now, we talk about communications. These are all sort of, I think, periphery things to what my personal view, the core goal of what each engagement group should be. So to me, the ultimate win is seeing what your priority areas are up on a leaders summit or up on a ministerial summit. So the end game is not the communique being launched in Maizuru, it's the advocacy that comes between, 1 December when the presidency is taken over, through to the leaders' communique. That to me is actually the most important piece of work that can happen, which is the advocacy into those communiques. And we all know that doesn't happen at the summit, that happens in those months before. So I think that we need to set that out very, very clearly and be very strategic about what those agenda items are. So the T20 Brazil can say, these are our priorities, this is how they align, and let's push for that from an advocacy perspective through what we're writing, through what those ideas are that we're generating. One thing I just wanted to pick up that you mentioned, Gulben, about the office being set up. I think it was Saudi set one up for about 5 years. It was several years before and then lasted a couple after. And that was both for track 1 and track 2. So there was staff in there who were actually the secretariat effectively of the track 2, which might be a product of their economic environment, but that was quite impressive, I thought.
Thank you. That's good to know. This has been a good discussion on the continuity, I think, on how we can make it better and continuous. But maybe one of the things that is happening, because the G7 is within the G20. The T7 is not so much within the T20, but maybe what we can do is to start engaging better the Troika and the T20 and the G20, start working together on joint papers and see what is common between us. And although the T7 is very different from the T20, you are still a part of us. We are not a part of you, but you are a part of us. And we do have an interesting time, right? You've got T20 and then you've got Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, all developing countries taking up. So it's a really good time to start thinking about what we can do together. So how can we, maybe that's a learning from this session. How much more can we do together? And really, maybe you've all noticed, why has the G20 agenda adopted some of the UN agendas? This is part of the problem. It just puts a burden on the G20.
Yeah, so it's been really a good learning process for me too. So I chaired T7, and then I'm also part of T20. And then what's the difference, what's the commonality? Then there are lots of commonalities, of course, because both fora are open to the think tanks in the world. So participating think tanks are the same people. Yes. But somehow organizers are different. Then, so in the big pot, the ingredients are same, but the taste of the soup or stew are very different if you add the curry powder or soy sauce, right? So last minute, so when we produce communique, then some difference. Or maybe from the beginning, like in T20, India, it's difficult to discuss something like nuclear disarmament, which Prime Minister Kishida of Japan really want to talk about in G7, right? So that's why the T7 also included then our summit had the one session about nuclear disarmament and also reconstruction of Ukraine. But the people from Global South, like Ambassador Chinoy, and then also Bambam Brojonegoro from he was T20 Indonesia's lead co-chair, right? They said, "Oh, the Ukraine is not the war in the Ukraine is not the only war in the world, right? So why the G7 focus on only that one?" So and then I think, oh, that's true. So so it's a nice learning process, and then but still there are many think tanks who and the people who want to discuss those issues. So that's why I'm saying using the different fora effectively and flexibly is a good idea. So it's very important to recognize there are differences, but lots of commonalities and similarities. Then also common interest, especially because we are living in the only one planet, right? So there must be the joint call to action. And then Samir, Ambassador Chinoy, Samir, and also Sachin, and Denis Suno, and other people, including myself, agree basically to make some joint call to action when the T20 India's communique is done.
I think Erin had a question she wanted to ask you.
Well, I don't have a question. I just wanted to respond to this conversation and situate it in the G20. And I say this as, you know, a little bit of a middle power down there in the south of the Indo-Pacific. But the strength of the G20 is around its inclusivity, that it is a big multilateral. You've got, 20 plus countries. And if we talk about, I think focusing on the G7 is really counterproductive to the strength of this organisation as encompassing an extraordinary amount of the global south. And the conversation should be around how do we strengthen those groups within the G20 rather than focus entirely on a G7 agenda. Not entirely, that's wrong. But if we focus on a G7 agenda, which already has such an extraordinary platform as it is, we need to be bringing the other countries, the middle powers, the global south, and that's what the G20 should be all about, and that should be dominating this conversation, particularly when we're talking about Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa. And that's where, as richer countries, we should be focusing on strengthening this institution. Oh, I've never had anyone applauding like that before. Thank you.
I think everybody agrees because there is a... Yeah. Because there is a constant, not fear, but acknowledgement that the G7 often hijacks the G20 agenda.
And this case in point, let's move away.
Would you like to respond?
Just add a footnote. The G20, of course, is much older. We, the other 13, have joined in much later. And having said that, if you see, for instance, the summit declarations of both groups, there are quite a few differences, much broader concern with development issues in the G20 than in the G7. But having said that, there are some overlapping issues. So perhaps, of course, making explicit the differences is something that might weaken the external image of the G20 by definition. But because there are some overlapping issues, we should perhaps start by working together on those issues and try and get to some homogeneous solutions or identification of solutions for those issues. And later on, be a bit more broaden the agenda.
Absolutely. Gulbin?
Thank you. Just very shortly, since Renato mentioned about some policy brief criterion, it should be written by two countries, two institutions at least. So we can bring non-G20 and G20 combinations so that we can bring, so they can be unwritten rules maybe, yes, so that we can ease the dominance of G7 and other countries.
So I'm going to ask everybody a question. We lost a really big and good friend in Jim when he died just in 2020. the think tank index from the University in Pennsylvania has not since been revived. Don't you think this is something we can do to strengthen the T20, the think tank index? It has just, right? Is this something that we'd all, maybe Dean Sonobe, it's something that the ADB can take upon itself? Or at least we can all pitch in and support that project, because it was wonderful. And people are still quoting the last T20 report, the think tank index.
We miss Jim, but he did an extremely difficult job because he because accountability is a big question, right? Because we are evaluated and then we evaluate them. It's very difficult. That's why we think tanks hesitate to say that let's restart that think tank index again. But we really wish to see the index again. So I hope some smart people in this room or outside can design a very nice, accountable, reliable, and also sustainable system of making index.
Okay. Would you like something?
Yes, as organizer, the possibility of having the as broad as possible list of think tanks is a precondition.
Yes.
In particular, because we have this principle or this concern of broadening as much as we can the participation of think tanks in as many countries as we can. So if we can count on broader lists of think tanks, contacts, that would be most helpful. And I would very much thank if anyone could provide us with additional information in this regard.
Maybe, very last words. I think we have to monitor the effectiveness of our T20 activities, the collaboration of the wider think tanks. Maybe we can come up with a checklist so that every host country can say we had this much submissions, we contributed. The citation, for example, is important as well. Not the quality, but not the quantity, but the quality matters. So maybe we can come up how many citations we had this year's publications, for example, and how many new think tanks that we gathered that this year, for example. We can, I think, measure those so we can come up with a monitoring scheme in spite of the index as well.
Yeah.
May I?
Yes.
Yeah, because the think tanks are different from universities. Think tanks are much smaller than even the smallest university, right? The number of researchers are very limited. So how can we compete with the number of citations? Because our strength is more in the convening power than our research power within the small organization. Like a Chatham House, we convene great people, great thinkers and researchers, and then the policymakers happy to listen to. And if the policymakers come to listen to, then the Nobel Prize winners are also happy to participate in the conversation, right? So the convening power is our strength, rather than because we are talking about the policy research. And then if we receive the kind of order from the government, please give us this knowledge, then we start, then it's too late. That's why we should ask the researchers in the world or wise people in the world, is there any good idea about this? Then surprisingly, from the unknown place, unknown researchers may give us great idea and saying that although this may be a new issue, policy issue in other countries, but in our country, this has been a very important problem for the last 10 years. That's why we have been working on this problem for already 6 years, 7 years, right? So, and then previously, think tanks had a very short list of researchers, so resource persons. But now, because of the digital technology, we can reach out the unknown researchers in unknown places, and then sometimes we receive very good responses. So that's why I don't like this citation
Maybe
idea.
citation is a big strong, but maybe just number of downloads, something.
So we will end this session. Thank you all very much. At least we've got a conversation started. We know what we have to do. And let's reconvene and discuss and see what we can do before we meet in Mysore again. So thank you very much. And thank you all.